Welcome to Save Us from Hell, our new podcast about the United Nations. I'm Mark Leon Goldberg, a international affairs journalist, the editor-in-chief of UN Dispatch, and I run Global Dispatches.
I'm Anjali Dayal. I'm an international relations scholar and an author at Fordham University in New York.
And we'll discuss who should replace Martin Griffiths, the outgoing Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, who is leaving his post at the end of the month.
We used to say that peacekeeping was the signature activity of the United Nations system, right? But we're now 10 years from the last authorization of a new peacekeeping mission. And we can see in that the sort of decline of political resolutions to conflict. And in the face of that, what we see is humanitarian action becoming the signature activity of the UN system.
And as part of his departure this week, Martin Griffiths penned an op-ed in the New York Times giving a rather grim overview of the state of humanitarian affairs around the world.
Yeah, his op-ed says, in his entire career working on humanitarian affairs, he's never faced a worse situation than he sees around the world today. And his op-ed, which I really recommend you take a look at, it's short and extremely pithy, right? It places the blame on leaders for this, right? And it says, the ultimate failure is a failure of leaders to their people. Just to sort of quote a little bit from the piece, right? He tells us that, precisely the situation we see around the world right now with all of these global humanitarian crises. He says, this is precisely the situation that the modern global order, created in the aftermath of World War II and embodied with heartfelt ambition in the United Nations Charter, was meant to prevent. The suffering of millions of people is clear evidence that we're failing, he says, right? But he says he doesn't believe this failure at heart lies with the UN, because he says the body is only as good as the commitment, effort, and resources that its members put in. For me, this is a failure of world leaders, he says. They are failing humanity by breaking the compact between ordinary people and those whom power is vested.
Yeah, I mean, on the humanitarian front, the UN is only as effective as the kind of resources at its disposal, both financial, humanitarian goods, and also, political resources, the ability to, cross battle lines or enter certain territories with humanitarian aid. And, to me, the departure of Martin Griffiths and speculation over who might replace him is of such consequence at the United Nations because, I mean, these days, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, in my mind, is arguably the second most important person in the United Nations system behind the Secretary General himself. I think it's just for the fact that, for the reasons we've discussed on this episode, and I'm sure we'll be discussing in future episodes, the ability of the United Nations to prevent conflicts and to manage conflicts has been muted as geopolitical tensions rise. So as a consequence, the UN is being turned to increasingly to look after the fallout of these conflicts, which is humanitarian crises and humanitarian disasters. And it is up to the top UN humanitarian official to coordinate responses, not only from across the UN system, but across like NGOs, things like Save the Children and Oxfam. They all kind of work with the office of the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs to coordinate the responses to these crises around the world. So this position is really significant in the UN system.
Yeah, absolutely. We started out talking about how the political space for things like mediation in conflicts shrinks as geopolitical tensions between the P5 rise. But as that geopolitical space shrinks, as the diplomatic space shrinks, it doesn't shrink the fact that the UN remains the only organization that at scale can tackle some of these disasters, some of these humanitarian disasters, and serve this coordinating function, as you note, right? This is particularly the case because we live in a world where civil wars are lasting longer with fewer negotiated settlements and more sort of cost to civilians. That's something we see international relations scholarship telling us, right? Volker Turk yesterday at the opening of the 56th annual session of the UN Human Rights Council noted that international humanitarian law and human rights norms are in decline worldwide in wars, right? With around the world as seeing civilians paying the blood cost for war, right? In ways that are prohibited under international law, in ways that are prohibited by the resolutions of the UN Security Council, right? In ways that states sign on to preventing when they sign on to the UN Charter. And in the face of that, the UN's humanitarian work becomes increasingly important. It becomes the organization's biggest, sort of most visible and most vital role
Mm-hmm.
for people living worldwide.
It's basically like the most impactful thing the United Nations does these days. And I think that's
Yeah.
why there is so much focus and attention on like the race to replace him. Will you
Yeah.
just talk us through what's like the process and procedure of replacing and selecting a senior, essentially like a cabinet level position at the United Nations? How does this work?
Yeah. These top posts, the selection process is not at all transparent,
Yeah.
right?
So that's why
It
I don't know
is,
it.
yeah, it's necessary. It's not maybe not necessarily opaque, but it is opaque. And one thing that we've seen over the last couple of years, so this position was established in 1991, right? It's a comparatively new position on the scale of UN positions, but it is one of the big positions that was traditionally reserved for one of the permanent five members of the Security Council, right? In a sort of big political grand bargain, right, that characterizes all the different parts of the UN system, the Secretary General is never a member of a P5 nation. But as a trade off, right, each of the P5 gets one of the big offices for one of their own nationals. And in the last couple of cycles, this office has gone to a British national.
So since 2004 or five, I can't remember which one. It was right around when I started covering the UN. Every lead humanitarian official, every undersecretary general for humanitarian affairs has been British. Not only have they been British, but they've kind of been like the same type of Brit. They've all kind of been just very competent, skilled diplomats who rose through the ranks of either the British diplomatic corps or British government or UN system by dint of their competence and by dint of their ability to get things done. They've not been like household names, right? They've not been
Right.
anyone that if you're outside the bubble, you've ever heard of in any other like context.
We're going to hear this later from Jan Egeland, right? But this sort of idea of the office as being reserved for a member of the
Mm-hmm.
P5 is one that has gotten a lot of backlash around
Mm-hmm.
the world from countries in the global south, from countries who are the recipients of humanitarian aid, right? In part because the overall move of the UN system, especially under Antonio Guterres, right, has been about thinking about local solutions to problems, right? And it's very hard to adopt a local set of solutions to problems, people say, if the sort of lead actor on this stage is a British man, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is highlighting a sort of colonial dynamic that can look and be incredibly problematic,
Mm-hmm.
right? The flip side of that, of course, is that it's a way of investing the P5 in the process of humanitarian aid, and it's a way of putting in that position someone who can rally the richest governments in the world
Mm-hmm.
to try and contribute to the cause. And so there are real trade offs when we think about what this informal system of reservation for the P5 does, and how the lack of transparency in how this person is selected enables the Secretary General to essentially play up what they think are going to be the most politically and operationally salient features of the job.
And I wonder, I just wonder if that's like part of the problem, that you're
Yeah.
one of the key challenges facing UN humanitarian issues. And I put this question to Jan Egeland as well, is the fact that the requirements for paying for humanitarian relief and disaster
Mhm.
recovery around the world are astronomical and only
Yeah.
getting bigger as climate change takes hold and as conflicts last longer. The money available to pay for all that humanitarian assistance is getting scarcer and scarcer. So I just wonder if instead of like having a very competent, skilled humanitarian operator and skilled diplomat, you need someone whose primary skill set is fundraising and being like a more prominent political face of the UN.
Yeah, it's interesting because another way we could think about that, right, is to think about um, the role that a politically visible person might play for fundraising. So if we take, for example, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights,
Yep.
that person has historically been someone with a little bit more visibility,
Yeah.
or someone who heads of state traditionally like recognize as being someone on par with the UN Secretary General. So Michelle Bachelet is the
Yeah.
classic case of this, right? Former head of state, someone with household recognition around the
Mary
world.
Robinson as
Yep.
well, Ireland's former president.
Prince Ziad, right?
Yeah, Prince Zaid Al Hussein, who is a very senior Jordanian diplomat, member of the Jordanian royal family. Everyone, knew him. And now
Yeah.
you mentioned him earlier. It's Volker Turk, but I'd never
Yeah.
heard of.
Well, so he's done remarkable work around the UN for years, but he's not a
Exactly.
household name,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And it is the kind of thing where, if we're thinking about what might balance the political role, Martin Griffiths talks at length about in his op-ed, but also, in other interviews he's given over the years about the importance of humanitarian mediation, right? How mediation, this political dimension of humanitarian aid and access, is actually key to success, right? And in that sense, someone with a more visible profile might serve the function of drawing attention to this job, also perhaps being able to rally countries to fundraise for it. Because I think the danger in looking for someone who's just good at fundraising, right,
Hmm.
might be that yes, fundraising is a skill that, as organizations everywhere know, is not immediately transferable from charisma or from, political savviness or from deep operational knowledge. And this position needs someone who can do all of these things, in part because, we said just a second ago that peacekeeping used to be the signature activity of the UN system, right? The peacekeeping budget is separate from the UN's operating budget, right? It is a dedicated separate budget that used to be larger than the UN's general operating budget, right? In some years, it was almost twice the UN's entire operating budget. It was still enormously small, right? At the peak, I think they were running 16 operations on one half of 1/10 of all global defense spending,
Hmm.
right? So it's like a rubber band level budget
It's like
still,
what the
right?
Pentagon loses in its couch cushions in any given year.
That's right, right? Like, you sneeze and you lose that at the Pentagon. But, that was a dedicated large budget that was separate from the UN's budget that didn't rely on sort of like circulating the sort of circulating the sort of offering bowl every time there was a crisis around the world. And so thinking about like how to offset increased humanitarian need in a world of decreased willingness to sort of invest in multilateral organizations, I think is a critical way to think about what kind of skill set this next leader might need to have. It harkens back to sort of the decision to put a former head of state at the helm of the UN or a former head of state at the helm of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights.